Our next speaker is Dr. Dominic Alexander. Dominic is the principal epidemiologist at Exponent, and I hope I have your title right. And Dominic actually may be known to some of you who attended the last GOED members meeting, because we've actually engaged Dominic to develop a scientific response to the recent prostate cancer study. And he's also done an analysis of the science on omega-3s and blood pressure. So he's going to talk a little bit about how you can interpret evidence when you have a negative crisis that comes out really generated by science. So Dominic, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So, if you can read the small print down here, I can actually do that for you if anybody needs anything done. So, actually it's kind of one of the themes that I'm talking about today is the evidence. And how do you prove it? How do you disprove it? What's going on? So it's complicated. We're constantly inundated with data. There are articles published all the time. We have studies of the day. We have open access journals now. It's easier to publish. There are more opportunities to publish. Online repositories for supplementary tables in some journals. So there's information everywhere. So typically, the more information we have on a topic, the better our understanding is of the relationship between an exposure and an outcome. And sure, it helps, and it may help tell the whole story, but it also may muddy the water a bit. Now we have more inconsistent findings across the literature, and then how do we sort that out? How do we make sense of those findings? So I'll talk today a little bit about summarizing, interpreting, communicating epidemiologic evidence. It's challenging, it's complex. Here's an overused slide a few years ago. Everybody who did a scientific presentation had this slide, so I don't use it anymore, but it does fit for this talk here. So again, we have studies published all the time. What do we believe? We have different media headlines. Eating food X causes disease Y. Another study comes out looking at the same thing. There's conflicting information. What do scientists believe? What does the general public believe? What do the consumers believe? It's confusing. So here's a topic that I've worked on for about 7 years. You can see an article comes out, diet study reaffirms red meat as a culprit in colon cancer. Another news blurb, eating red meat will not increase colorectal cancer risk. So what do you believe? Which study? Which study's better? Consumers don't know. Most scientists don't know. But yet we're dealing with all this information. We're faced with conflicting stories. Obviously, a study of the day can impact the market. I wasn't here yesterday, but we're aware of what that study did. You know which study I'm talking about. So, what kind of angle do we take to approach the literature and approach the evidence? Some consumers are sick of seeing this. They're like, well, it tastes good, I'm going to eat it anyway. I don't care what it says. Other consumers take it to heart. So again, these are studies of the day. So what we did, and I've published several papers on this topic, look at the totality of the evidence. Put everything together to make an informed decision. So we have one study here, we have one study there, but what does the total body of evidence say? So that's what we did. And then others started talking about it. Well, maybe we should take a look. Maybe there's reason to challenge this commonly held belief. Okay. So I'm an epidemiologist. I study distribution of disease in human populations. There are many different types of epidemiology, but I focus on systematic review methodology, meta-analyses, and disease causation. So I specialize in putting the evidence together to make an informed decision. And actually, when I do nutritional epidemiology, I'm somewhat of an anti-epidemiologist. Most nutritional epidemiologists out there don't like me because I basically call it like it is. I take a critical point of view when I look at the studies and look at the methodology of the studies. So how do we interpret and communicate the evidence? Obviously, there's many methodological issues, challenges, source of uncertainty. So we're faced with difficult problems of interpretation, arises from deep complexity, whether it's your internal biases, philosophical reasons, your view or judgment of the evidence. We also have limitations of the scientific research itself. So all of this uncertainty makes reliable scientific interpretation an even greater challenge for scientists themselves, for epidemiologists, for clinicians, for policymakers, consumers. So we're all aware of the on-again, off-again feature of specific recommendations that we see. Come out every week, media's interpretation of a study. So a lot of people look at the abstract. They read the bottom line in the abstract, the conclusion. That's what's going to make the headline. Even though that conclusion may not even be supported by the evidence within that study. So obviously, communicating scientific information is of fundamental importance to evaluate current standards of practice, inform public health policy, regulatory, political, legal, ethical guidelines, and so on. However, accurate, objective dissemination of such information is compromised by numerous factors. There may be real associations, real scientists doing real things, but we all have some type of biases. There's always methodological limitations. Again, it gets back to this overarching theme, the totality of the evidence. So we can't take a study in isolation and make public health policy or changes based on that single study. We may have researcher bias, methodological limitations, lack of scientific knowledge, dare I say fraud as well. So we have to sort through all of these issues. And then we can start, perhaps to effectively, accurately articulate scientific information. To do so, we need methodological foundation, systematic methodological approach to do that. So really, we all care about the results, right? The results are important in studies. That's what, that helps in inform decisions and make interpretations. We may have patients or clients. But the results don't matter if the underlying methodological foundation is compromised. That's where we have to start. So it's not just does exposure to a factor contribute to an outcome. Rather, really, how do we appropriately evaluate an association between an exposure and an outcome? Once we can get that established, then we can start talking about the results. So really, we have to strive for objective, transparent methodological process. That's the key. We have to make sure that the interpretation of the evidence is supported by the research data and information. Let the science speak for itself. Just because we may see an association in a study, that doesn't mean that your study is the be-all and end-all of the situation. Again, totality. What's the body of literature say about this topic? So once we start getting an understanding of these key methodological underpinnings, then we can start to begin to effectively, accurately communicate this information. So it's tough. It's tough to convey complex scientific information to different audiences. I mean, we're talking about other scientists, policymakers, dietary guidelines committees, general public, consumers, something that I do too often, a jury. It's difficult. But once we start to coalesce this information, we can do different things. We can look at weight of evidence assessments or conduct these evidence-based reviews. Something that I do in great frequency is meta-analysis methodology. So again, we have so much information out there, we can put it together in a quantitative meta-analysis. But before doing so, when we set this up, we have to be cognizant of all the factors within and across studies. How strong is the association? Is there a potential dose-response pattern? Is there some kind of underlying biologically plausible mechanism? How consistent are the findings across the literature? So once we start to sort that out, we can use a meta-analysis to take a closer look. So meta-analysis is a systematic quantitative method for which results data are combined across studies to produce an overall weighted average of effect or summary relative risk estimate. So everybody now wants a meta-analysis. We have more data to work with. So the more data that we have to work with, the more analyses we can run collectively. So you can see the number of meta-analyses indexed in PubMed by year. There's a monotonic increase that continues to rise. So, however, the results of a meta-analysis are only as valid as the validity of the studies going into the model. So we've all heard garbage in, garbage out. We can't mix apples and oranges. We have to have the same exposure. We have to have the same outcome. We can't mix prostate cancer with breast cancer. Again, it has to be the same. But even within that collection of similar studies, we have different types of apples, of course. So big studies, small studies, clinical trials, observational studies, category that I call these look good too, where if you do an analysis, same exposure, same outcome has to be the same, you're just not quite statistically significant. But now you have another study of either kind of a similar exposure or similar outcome but not the same. Maybe you can slip that study into the mix. Now you have your significant positive association. A lot of litigation cases I work on, I notice that. Some researchers do that unintentionally. It happens. That's why we need that objective, transparent methodological process. And you're not going to get that from reading an abstract. You're not going to get that maybe from reading the full text. So again, it's a challenge. Scientists need to, and epidemiologists need to adhere to the methodological principles. Another issue that we're faced with is publication bias or reporting bias. Greater likelihood that studies are significant and positive are more likely to be published over those that are null, inverse, not statistically significant. Such positive, significant findings are more likely to be cited by other scientists, more likely to be picked up by the media. I mean, let's face it, eating food X may cause disease Y. That makes a headline. You don't see as many headlines, eating food X, study shows null association with this outcome. It's not as catchy. It doesn't happen. But again, that's where the study of the day comes in. That's where some studies are overhyped, and that can have a significant impact on consumers, the marketplace, other scientists. Okay. So some of examples of our work, 3 projects commissioned by GOED over the past year plus. The first, comprehensive meta-analysis of randomized controlled clinical trials looking at EPA, DHA, and blood pressure. So we had a very, very robust data set, 70 RCTs included in this meta-analysis. I do meta-analyses daily. We never get a data set this large. So it's really nice to work with things we can explore, analyses from different angles. This was also submitted as a health claim. So again, we want to effectively communicate this information. Health claim does it. Publications do that. Let the science speak for itself. I'm proud to say this was recently accepted, the American Journal of Hypertension, a top hypertension journal. So look for this coming out hopefully in the next month or two in print form. EPA, DHA, and coronary heart disease, I'm not going to share too much of that. That's in process. Again, a very comprehensive meta-analysis, large data set to work with, reductions in risk in coronary heart disease and other correlates of CHD. So again, we're writing that up. We'll be submitting that soon. And then finally, everybody's favorite topic, omega-3 and prostate cancer. So I have a few slides on that soon. Okay, so just very briefly, a couple highlights from the blood pressure paper. This is a forest plot. You may have seen these over the past couple days. I'm not sure, I wasn't here. But we looked at everything again, right? The strongest findings were among hypertensive subjects. So we saw A statistically significant 4 or 5 point reduction in systolic pressure among hypertensive subjects, but importantly, we also saw significant decreases in blood pressure among normotensive subjects. So putting all the data together, all subjects, we see a statistically significant drop, systolic blood pressure. Same story for diastolic blood pressure. More pronounced among hypertensive subjects, 2 to 3 point drop, that's statistically significant. Consistent findings. Again, normotensives as well, statistically significant reduction. All subjects, we see a drop in blood pressure. Again, this may not seem like huge drops, but looking at the overwhelming body of evidence, these findings are consistent, statistically significant, 70 RCTs to work with. And this may have a very significant major public health impact. Okay. Now back to what everybody likes to talk about, everybody likes to hear about, prostate cancer. So what's going on here, really? What's the story? You know, that's what we all want to know. And to be honest with you, I do a lot of nutritional epidemiology work. I do a lot of work in occupational environmental epidemiology. I do a lot of litigation work. I focus on disease causation and putting the evidence together. When I put the evidence together for this topic, and I say, well, what's going on here? The answer is not much. You know, and I'm sorry that a study or two may have affected the industry, and it's unfortunate. That's why I like to get back to the totality of the evidence as opposed to a single study. So to do this, to do a formal assessment, we look at dietary intake studies, we look at biomarker studies, we look at tumor stage, tumor grade, stratify by different factors, duration of follow-up, and so on. So I don't have time. This is under review right now, so I can't share too much. But overall, for the dietary intake studies, at the bottom, the summary relative risk estimate is 1.0. Null value. No increased risk, no decreased risk. Nothing at all is going on. Now, the biomarker studies, that's where the most, I guess, contention comes from. So, again, a very weak overall association, a summary relative risk of 1.07. This is tiny. This is nothing. So I deal with relative risks of 2, 3, 4, 5, and on. Smoking and lung cancer, relative risk of 10 to 20. We're talking 1.07. Very weak association. Importantly, prostate cancer, carcinogenesis, may take years. May take 10, 20, 30 years, 3 decades. So you'd think that if the exposure contributed to causing the outcome, that the longer the study, the clearer that relationship would be. The true relationship would come out. But here we see in the studies conducted less than 10 years, shorter duration, we see the stronger effect of 1.12. Again, it's a weak effect, but stronger relative to studies that were conducted for longer duration, where we actually see a non-significant 7% decrease in prostate cancer risk. Again, we have to put this together for a causal assessment. This doesn't make sense in terms of a potential causal relationship. Now, actually, the biggest area of contention is biomarker studies, high-grade prostate cancer. And you can see the strongest association that we observed was a summary relative risk for high-grade, more aggressive tumors, 1.2. Low-grade, you can see the relative risk there. It's almost half. But again, a non-statistically significant finding. You know, we had 4 studies. The 2 strongest studies, I think, were presented perhaps yesterday. And, you know, we have 2 studies showing a decreased risk. And actually, there's some unpublished data out there from Harvard that shows another decreased risk. So we add that to the fold, and the summary relative risk goes down to at 1.15, 1.16, and again, not statistically significant. But again, this is the totality of the evidence But the focus, media attention has been on a single study, really. But we have to go back to this, and this is what's important. A single study in isolation doesn't tell the whole story, but this does. Okay, so what are things that we can do? You know, from an epidemiologist, you know, I have a different perspective. I'm not supposed to go on Twitter or things like that. I get in trouble from it because I do litigation stuff. I get in trouble. So, you know, for me, let the science speak for itself. I need to continue to conduct research, objective, transparent, methodological process. Need to continue to publish findings. They need to undergo the peer review process. That stands the test. Well, I don't want to say stands the test of time because there's tons of really bad studies out there. But we really need to publish the findings, let the science speak for itself. Don't make assertions or conclusions that aren't backed by the underlying science in your study. Don't just look at the abstract and just believe that to be the gold standard, because usually it's not. Continue to present research findings, different scientific conferences, meetings, forums, advisory committees, and so on. Maybe approach some media outlets to get the word out there, get the right word out there, and speak up and challenge. If something is wrong, if there's a flawed study, challenge it. Get it out in the open. I'm really big on transparency. Let's talk about the science. Let's talk about the methods. Tell me how you arrived at the conclusion and show me how you arrived at that conclusion. That's important. So again, for me, it's the method that matters. That's the most important thing. So, thank you.